Right now, across Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhoods, luxury apartment prices are crashing in ways nobody predicted possible. Russian penthouses worth $50 million sitting completely empty after government seizures. Chinese billionaires who used to buy entire floors vanished overnight because their government won't let them move money out anymore. Ken Griffin just took his $43 billion hedge fund Citadel and moved the entire headquarters to Miami. And this isn't just affecting billionaires in their Central Park towers. This is the beginning of something catastrophic that's about to cascade through the entire New York property market in ways that will determine whether you can afford to stay, whether you'll be forced to sell your apartment, and whether your New York dream becomes your greatest asset or your most devastating financial nightmare. Write in the comments, New York collapse warning, if you're concerned about what's coming for Manhattan property values. Because what's happening in New York right now is something this city has never experienced in modern history. The international buyer class that propped up luxury prices for decades has completely disappeared. Russian oligarchs got sanctioned and their properties seized. Chinese capital flight restrictions mean those buyers are gone forever. Middle Eastern wealth is moving to London and Dubai. And Wall Street titans who built their empires here are quietly evacuating to Florida and Texas. This isn't a normal market cycle. This is the systematic destruction of the buyer base that made New York luxury real estate the most expensive in America. But first, make sure to subscribe to USA Housing Truth, because we're bringing you the explosive investigation into New York's collapse that mainstream media refuses to cover honestly. All right, here's what the New York real estate industry desperately doesn't want you to understand. Manhattan luxury apartments just entered a death spiral that nobody can stop. $20 million penthouses that sold in 48 hours back in 2019 now sit empty for 8 months, 10 months, sometimes over a year with zero serious offers. Luxury apartments above $15 million saw sales volume collapse 38% year over year. That's not a slowdown. That's complete market paralysis and panic. Sellers are terrified, buyers have vanished, and the gap between what sellers need to get and what anyone's willing to pay is widening into an impossible chasm every single week. Stay right here, because what I'm about to reveal next shows you exactly why Ken Griffin abandoning New York was the signal that changed everything forever. Let's start with what actually happened to the international money that built New York luxury. For 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, Manhattan was the safest place on earth for global billionaires to park wealth. Russian oligarchs bought penthouses as wealth storage. Chinese billionaires moved hundreds of millions into New York real estate to escape Beijing's control. Middle Eastern royalty owned entire floors they visited twice a year. These weren't people buying homes. These were people buying financial safety in the most stable city in the world. And they paid absolutely any price because price didn't matter when you're hiding $50 million from your government or protecting assets from political chaos. But everything changed catastrophically, starting in 2022. Russian oligarchs got hit with sanctions after Ukraine invasion. Properties worth hundreds of millions seized by the government overnight. Roman Abramovich-style billionaires who owned multiple New York penthouses suddenly couldn't access their assets. Their apartments sit completely empty right now. Nobody can buy them because they're frozen legally. Nobody can sell them because ownership is disputed. They're just dead capital sitting in the most expensive buildings in America going nowhere. And Russian buyers who might have purchased represented 15 to 20% of all luxury sales above $10 million annually. That buyer class vanished completely in 6 months and is never coming back. Then Chinese capital controls got brutally enforced. Beijing decided they didn't want billionaires moving money overseas anymore. They cracked down hard. Chinese nationals now face $50,000 annual limits on foreign transfers. You physically cannot move $10 million to buy a New York penthouse anymore, even if you want to desperately. The Chinese government won't allow the transaction. And Chinese buyers at their peak represented 25 to 30% of Manhattan luxury purchases above $8 million. Another massive buyer segment completely eliminated permanently. Don't you dare click away, because what comes next exposes how Wall Street's exodus triggered the luxury market collapse nobody saw coming. Now let's talk about what happened with America's own billionaires, and why that's even more terrifying for New York real estate. Ken Griffin built Citadel into a $43 billion empire in Chicago, then moved it to New York because that's where financial power lived. New York was the center of American capitalism. If you wanted to be a player in finance, you had to be in Manhattan. But in 2022, Ken Griffin looked at New York's future and made a decision that should have terrified every property owner in the city. He moved Citadel's entire headquarters to Miami. Not a satellite office, not a secondary location. The entire headquarters. Hundreds of employees, billions in capital, all evacuated from New York to Florida. And he wasn't alone in abandoning the greatest city. Carl Icahn, the legendary activist investor, left New York. Paul Singer's Elliott Management moved to Florida. Dozens of hedge funds and private equity firms quietly relocated headquarters or opened major Florida offices and moved key personnel. These are the people who made millions and hundreds of millions annually. These are the people who bought $5 million, $10 million, $20 million apartments without blinking. These are the people whose wealth sustained New York luxury real estate for decades. And they looked at New York's taxes, crime, politics, and future trajectory, and decided Florida was better. When billionaires who built empires in New York start leaving, that tells you something catastrophic about where this city is heading. Here's what makes this even more devastating for Manhattan property values. These financial titans didn't just leave, they're actively telling other wealthy people to leave too. Ken Griffin publicly criticized New York's policies. Carl Icahn has been vocal about why he left. Every hedge fund manager who relocates becomes a walking advertisement for why New York isn't worth it anymore for the wealthy. And when the narrative shifts from New York as the center of the world to New York as a place smart money evacuates from, property values cannot sustain themselves at current levels. The psychology that supported $50 million penthouses was, I need to be in New York because that's where power is. When power itself leaves for Miami, what's the justification for paying those prices? Keep your eyes locked here, because what I'm about to expose next reveals the impossible mathematics destroying New York luxury buyers right now. Now let's look at what's happening with the few remaining wealthy buyers who haven't fled yet, and why even they cannot sustain this market. Time 0.5s. A $20 million luxury apartment in Manhattan today faces costs that are absolutely insane and getting worse. Property taxes on a $20 million apartment run roughly $200,000 annually. Maintenance fees in luxury buildings often hit $10,000 to $15,000 monthly. That's another $120,000 to $180,000 per year. You're looking at $320,000 to $380,000 annually just to own the property before you pay a single dollar of mortgage. If you're financing even half of that $20 million at current rates around 6.5%, you're paying another $54,000 monthly in mortgage interest. That's $648,000 annually. Add it all up, and you're spending over $1 million every single year just to live in a luxury Manhattan apartment. You need to earn probably $2.5 to $3 million annually after taxes just to afford the carrying costs comfortably. How many people in America earn $3 million after tax? Maybe 20,000 people total. And half of them just decided Florida and Texas have better math with zero state income tax and cheaper everything. The buyer pool for $20 million Manhattan apartments has shrunk from maybe 5,000 potential buyers globally to perhaps 500 domestically. And those 500 are all seriously reconsidering if New York is worth it. But it gets catastrophically worse for luxury sellers desperate to exit. The new mansion tax that New York implemented adds devastating transfer costs that make buying completely insane for wealthy purchasers. On a $20 million purchase, the mansion tax is 2.75%. That's $550,000 in additional taxes just to complete the transaction. You're paying over $500,000 in taxes before you own anything. For wealthy buyers who have unlimited options globally, why would they choose to pay an extra $550,000 in New York taxes when they could buy in Miami with zero state tax, lower property taxes, and no mansion tax? The math makes absolutely no sense unless you desperately need to be in Manhattan specifically. And fewer people desperately need Manhattan anymore. Stay with me, because what comes next shows you the cascading collapse from luxury into middle market that nobody can stop. Here's what's starting to happen, and will accelerate devastatingly over the next 18 months. The luxury market above 15 million has completely frozen. Those properties aren't selling. When they do sell, it's at massive discounts of 20 to 30% from peak asking prices. Sellers are getting desperate and panicked. But here's the critical part that affects everyone in New York. When luxury doesn't sell, those buyers who would have moved up don't move. That freezes the $8 to $15 million market. When 8 to 15 million freezes, the 4 to 8 million market can't move either because nobody's buying from them. And when 4 to 8 million stalls, that pressure cascades all the way down to regular middle-class apartments in the 200,000 to 500,000 range. The entire Manhattan market is connected like a chain. When the top luxury link breaks, eventually the whole chain collapses downward. We're already seeing this cascade accelerate in real transaction data. Properties in the 4 to 8 million range are sitting on the market 47% longer than a year ago. Price reductions in this segment jumped from 18% of listings to 31%. Sellers in the middle luxury tier are panicking because they see what happened above them, and they know it's coming for their segment next. Everyone's trying to sell before the cascade reaches them. But when everyone tries to sell simultaneously, and nobody wants to buy because they're waiting for lower prices, you get a market in complete freefall with no bottom in sight. And the few people who are still buying are making brutally low offers because they know sellers are desperate. A property listed at $6.5 million gets an offer at $4.8 million. The seller is insulted and rejects it. 3 months later, they get an offer at $4.5 million. They reject that too. 6 months later, the only offer is $4.2 million, and by then they're so financially exhausted they have to take it. That's a 35% haircut from original asking price. And every sale like that resets the comparable prices for the entire neighborhood lower, which means the next seller has to price even lower, which means the cascade accelerates downward faster. This is how markets collapse in slow motion until suddenly they're collapsing very fast. Don't go anywhere, because what I'm about to reveal next exposes why New York's co-op board system is making this crisis exponentially worse. Now here's something unique to New York that's making this luxury collapse even more devastating. The co-ops board system that exists nowhere else in America. For people outside New York, here's how it works. In most cities, when you buy an apartment, you own it. In New York luxury buildings, many are structured as co-ops where you don't own your apartment. You own shares in a corporation that owns the building, and those shares give you the right to live in a specific unit. And to buy into a co-op, you need approval from the co-op board. They review your finances, interview you, and can reject you for basically any reason without explanation. This system worked fine when there were hundreds of wealthy buyers competing for every apartment. Boards could be selective and choose the best applicants. But now, with international buyers gone and domestic wealthy buyers fleeing, co-op boards are facing a catastrophic crisis. They're rejecting the few remaining qualified buyers for arbitrary reasons, which means apartments sit empty for months longer. Sellers are trapped because even when they find a buyer willing to pay their price, the co-op board might reject them. And every month an apartment sits empty. The seller is paying those massive monthly fees I mentioned earlier. $10,000, $15,000, sometimes $20,000 monthly in maintenance, just hemorrhaging cash while waiting for board approval that might never come. Some desperate sellers are now offering to pay buyers first-year maintenance fees, cover all closing costs, even throw in furniture and art worth hundreds of thousands, anything to get someone through the co-op board approval and close the sale. That's how panicked the luxury market has become. But buyers see this desperation and they wait even longer, because they know if sellers are this desperate now, they'll be even more desperate in 3 months. Why pay $5 million today when it might be $4.5 million by spring? This waiting game between desperate sellers and patient buyers is creating a doom loop that feeds on itself and cannot break without massive price capitulation. Keep watching, because what comes next reveals how regular middle-class New Yorkers are about to get crushed by this luxury collapse. Now let's talk about what this means for regular New York apartments and middle-class families who thought luxury problems don't affect them. The median Manhattan apartment price officially sits at $1.1 million as of late 2025. That sounds somewhat stable on the surface. But that median is hiding something absolutely massive. Luxury above $5 million is down 18% year over year. Upper middle around $2 to $5 million is down 11%. The middle tier from $800,000 to $2 million is just starting to crack, with prices down 4%. The only segment holding relatively stable is below $600,000, and that's only because those buyers have no other options. They need to live somewhere in New York for work. They cannot move to Florida or Texas. They're trapped in the New York market. But here's what's coming for them over the next 12 to 24 months that should terrify every middle-class New York family. As luxury collapses and wealthy residents evacuate, the tax base that funded city services evaporates. New York relies on taxing the wealthy to provide services for everyone. When billionaires leave and luxury property values crash, the city faces massive budget shortfalls. How do they make up that revenue? They raise property taxes on everyone else. They raise income taxes. They cut services. Your quality of life decreases while your costs increase. That's the death spiral that makes middle-class people start questioning if New York is worth it anymore. And when middle-class families start leaving too, that puts even more pressure on property values across every segment. We're already seeing the early warning signs of middle-class exodus accelerating. New York lost over 300,000 residents between 2020 and 2023. Some was pandemic-related, but much of it was people who looked at the cost of living, looked at the taxes, looked at crime and quality of life, and decided other cities offered better value. Remote work made this possible. If you can work from anywhere, why pay $1.1 million for a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan when you can get a beautiful house in North Carolina or Tennessee for $400,000? The justification for New York's insane housing costs was always you need to be here for the jobs and the opportunities. When jobs can be done remotely, that justification collapses. And without that justification, New York property prices have no fundamental support at current levels. Now let's talk about what's happening with New York landlords and investors, because this is creating dynamics that will reshape the entire market. Small landlords in New York are facing absolutely brutal economics right now. Property taxes keep rising. Maintenance costs are through the roof. Rent control. Regulations make it nearly impossible to raise rents enough to cover increasing costs. Insurance has skyrocketed. Many small landlords are losing money every single month on properties that used to generate positive cash flow. They're trapped in rent-controlled buildings where they cannot raise rent, but their costs keep climbing. And unlike Florida, where small landlords could at least sell to desperate families, in New York, the buyer pool has vanished. Who wants to buy a rent-controlled building that loses money monthly? Stay locked in, because what I'm about to share next reveals the institutional buyer takeover that's quietly happening while small owners flee in panic. The result is small New York landlords are trying desperately to sell to anyone who will buy. And the only buyers are massive institutional investors, like Blackstone and private equity firms who can weather short-term losses and play the long game. They're buying buildings from panicked small landlords at 30 to 40% discounts, waiting out rent control tenants, and planning to renovate and flip to luxury in 5 to 10 years when they think the market might recover. This is the consolidation of New York real estate into the hands of Wall Street firms and foreign sovereign wealth funds who have unlimited capital and infinite time horizons. Small landlords cannot compete with that. Regular families cannot compete with that. The middle class is being systematically priced out and pushed out by forces they cannot control or fight. And here's what makes this even more terrifying for every New York property owner. The institutional buyers aren't paying current market prices. They're paying what they think properties will be worth after the crash fully plays out. They're pricing in another 20 to 30% decline from current levels over the next 2 to 3 years. When the smartest money in real estate is betting on massive continued decline, that tells you exactly where this market is heading. And when those institutional buyers own 40%, 50%, eventually 60% of New York rental buildings, they'll control pricing completely. They'll control who can afford to live in this city. Small property owners will be extinct. Middle-class families will be priced out entirely. New York will become a city for the ultra-wealthy and the poor with nothing in between. Now let's look at what actually happens over the next 18 to 36 months, because the timeline matters enormously. Luxury above. 15 million continues falling another 15 to 25% from current levels, as international buyers stay gone and domestic wealthy keep leaving. The 8 to 15 million segment follows with 12 to 18% cumulative decline as the cascade spreads. 4 to 8 million sees 10 to 15% drops as panic selling accelerates. Middle market from 1 to 4 million holds relatively stable initially, but cracks in year 2 with 5 to 8% decline as quality of life deteriorates and middle-class exodus accelerates. Only the below 600,000 segment might stay flat because those buyers are trapped and have no alternatives. Don't click away, because what comes next tells you exactly what you need to do right now based on your specific New York situation. Transaction volumes stay suppressed across all segments as buyers wait for lower prices and sellers refuse to accept reality. Co-op board rejections increase as buildings become more desperate and paranoid about approving anyone who might not afford long-term fees. The gap between luxury asking prices and actual sale prices widens from current 15% to 25 or 30% as desperation intensifies. Institutional investors accelerate purchases of distressed properties from small landlords at Depression-era pricing. Property tax increases hit middle-class owners hard as city tries desperately to replace lost revenue from wealthy exodus. Crime and quality of life issues continue as budget cuts reduce services. More middle-class families question if New York is worth the cost. Population decline accelerates particularly among families with children and high earners under 50 who have job mobility. Here's what this means for different groups of New York residents. If you own a luxury property above $5 million, you need to make a brutal decision right now. Can you afford to hold this property for 5 to 7 years minimum until the market potentially recovers? If not, selling now even at current depressed prices might be smarter than waiting until you're forced to sell at even worse prices. The international buyers aren't coming back. Domestic wealthy are still leaving. Your buyer pool has permanently shrunk. Every month you hold hoping for better prices is a month of massive carrying costs hemorrhaging your wealth. Sometimes cutting losses is the financially smart move even when it hurts emotionally. If you own middle market property in the 1 to 4 million range, you're in the most dangerous position. You're about to get squeezed from both sides. Luxury collapse above you is cascading downward. Middle-class pressure below you is building upward. Your segment is where these two forces collide most violently. You need to honestly assess if you can weather a potential 10 to 15% decline over 2 years while paying higher property taxes and watching services deteriorate. If your financial situation is tight, selling before the cascade fully reaches your segment might preserve more equity than waiting and hoping. If you're renting and thinking about buying, do the most brutally honest math of your life. Don't buy because you feel like you should, or because owning is the dream. Buy only if the numbers genuinely make sense for your specific situation, and you plan to stay minimum 7 to 10 years. In a falling market, renting is often dramatically smarter financially than buying and catching a falling knife. The people who buy at the bottom of this crash in 2 to 3 years will build enormous wealth. The people who buy now, trying to time the bottom, will lose hundreds of thousands. Be patient. Wait for genuine capitulation, which hasn't happened yet. You'll know it when luxury sellers are accepting 40 to 50% discounts from peak. That's true bottom. We're not there yet. Stay with me, because what comes next gives you the critical warning signs to watch for New York's complete collapse. If you're a small landlord losing money monthly on rent-controlled buildings, you need to seriously consider selling to institutional buyers, even at steep discounts. They're the only buyers who'll take rent-controlled properties off your hands. Yes, you'll take a huge loss from what you think the property should be worth. But if you're hemorrhaging $5,000, $8,000, $10,000 monthly in negative cash flow, how long can you sustain that? Holding and hoping while losing money every month is how landlords go bankrupt. Sometimes selling at a loss preserves enough capital to invest somewhere else with better economics. The sunk cost fallacy destroys more wealth than almost anything else in real estate. Don't let emotional attachment to a property bankrupt you financially. If you're middle class with kids thinking about New York's future, you need to have honest conversations about whether this city still offers what your family needs. The schools that made New York attractive are facing budget cuts. Parks and services are deteriorating. Crime is a concern that won't improve with budget pressure. Cost of living keeps rising while quality of life declines. Remote work options mean your job might not require you to stay. Your kids might have better opportunities and safer childhoods in cities that cost half as much. That's not giving up on New York or admitting defeat. That's making smart family decisions based on current reality rather than nostalgia for what New York used to be. The New York you grew up in or moved to 20 years ago doesn't exist anymore. You need to decide if the New York that exists today is worth the sacrifices you're making to stay. Here's the absolute bottom line that every New York resident needs to understand with clarity. New York's real estate market isn't crashing in one dramatic collapse, but it is tanking systematically from the top down, as the buyer base that sustained luxury prices has permanently disappeared. Russian oligarchs aren't coming back. Chinese billionaires can't get money out. Wall Street titans are relocating to Florida and Texas. The international money that made New York luxury the most expensive in the world is gone forever. And without that money, the prices cannot hold at anywhere near current levels. Ken Griffin leaving was the signal everyone should have recognized. Carl Icahn leaving confirmed it. Every hedge fund that relocates is another nail in the coffin of New York exceptionalism. When the titans of finance who built empires here decide the city isn't worth it anymore, that tells you everything about where property values are heading. The cascade from luxury to middle market is accelerating and will intensify over the next 2 years. The co-op board system is making everything worse by blocking the few remaining buyers from completing purchases. Property taxes will rise as the wealthy tax base evaporates. Services will decline as budgets get slashed. Quality of life will deteriorate as the city enters a death spiral of losing residents, losing revenue, cutting services, which causes more residents to leave. And property values across all segments will continue grinding lower month after month after month until eventually we reach true capitulation, where sellers finally accept the new reality and slash prices 40 to 50% from peak to find any buyers at all. Don't go anywhere, because what comes next gives you the final action steps to protect yourself from New York's collapse. Time, Wawans. The people who understand what's happening, who can read the signals correctly, who can separate New York mythology from New York reality, those are the people who will protect their wealth and maybe even profit from this crisis. Whether that means selling luxury property now before the cascade fully accelerates, holding middle market property only if you can genuinely afford potential declines, renting instead of buying to preserve capital and flexibility, or relocating your family to cities with better economics and quality of life. The key is making decisions based on the actual data and actual buyer dynamics rather than emotional attachment to what New York used to represent. The greatest city in the world narrative that justified insane property prices for decades is collapsing. The global elite have voted with their feet and their capital. They're leaving. They're not coming back. And without them, New York luxury real estate has no floor. This isn't about hating New York or wanting the city to fail. This is about protecting yourself and your family from financial devastation by understanding market forces that are bigger than any individual can fight. The Russian penthouses sitting empty and seized aren't coming back to market. The Chinese capital that bought entire floors is blocked permanently. The hedge fund billions that sustained luxury are moving to Miami. These aren't temporary problems that fix themselves. These are permanent structural changes to who can afford to buy New York real estate at these price levels. And when the buyer pool shrinks by 40 to 60% permanently, prices have to adjust downward dramatically to match the smaller remaining demand. That adjustment is happening right now in slow motion. It's visible in the data for anyone willing to look honestly. And over the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to accelerate until it's visible to everyone who kept pretending New York was special and immune to normal market forces. If this investigation helped you understand what's really happening behind the Manhattan luxury collapse headlines, make sure you're subscribed to USA Housing Truth so you don't miss our next deep dive. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to New York's systematic market destruction. Comment below with New York collapse if you're watching the greatest city become the greatest real estate disaster. Subscribe and turn on notifications for updates as this crisis develops and more wealthy residents evacuate. Share this with at least 3 people who own property in New York or are considering buying, because they desperately need to know what's coming. Because what happens over the next 2 years in Manhattan is going to determine who protects their wealth and who gets completely destroyed financially by believing the mythology that New York real estate always goes up.